For years, Westwood Industries was ruled by fear. Every step in the marble halls echoed with the weight of one man's power, Richard Hale, a millionaire CEO whose reputation was built on silence, obedience, and control. Employees learned to keep their heads down, their voices low, and their dreams even lower. No one dared to challenge him. Until one ordinary morning, a secretary named Clara Bennett walked into his office and shattered the silence. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't powerful, but she carried something no one else had ever dared to bring into Richard Hale's world: courage. From spilled coffee to boardroom battles, from whispered rebellions to dangerous betrayals, Clara would push against a system designed to crush her. And in doing so, she would uncover the hidden wounds behind Richard's iron mask. Could empathy soften a tyrant? Could trust replace fear in a company built on intimidation? This is a story of courage, betrayal, and transformation. And it all begins with one question. What happens when the most feared man in the room finally meets the one person who refuses to bow? Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to the channel because you won't want to miss a single moment of this journey. The lobby of Westwood Industries gleamed like a cathedral, built not for worship, but for power. Polished marble floors reflected the steady hum of shoes and heels, each click echoing as if it belonged to someone important. Clara Bennett paused just inside the revolving doors, smoothing the lapel of her second-hand blazer. It was her first day as executive secretary to the most feared man in the company, Richard Hale, and though she had rehearsed her calm smile a dozen times in the mirror that morning, her stomach still fluttered like loose pages in the wind. She carried a leather tote over her shoulder, the strap worn from years of service, and a paper cup of coffee balanced in her hand. Outside, the Chicago wind had whipped her auburn hair loose from its bun, leaving a strand tickling her cheek. She brushed it back with the faintest sigh, then took her first step toward a job that would change her life. The receptionist at the front desk gave her a look halfway between sympathy and curiosity. "You must be the new secretary," she said, voice hushed as if she didn't want anyone important to overhear. "Good luck. You'll need it." Clara gave a polite smile, but before she could answer, her heel caught on the edge of a rug. The paper cup wobbled, tilted, and in the space of a heartbeat, it slipped from her hand. Coffee arced through the air, rich and steaming, before splattering across the pinstripe suit of a man striding out of the elevator. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that seemed to bend the air around him. His steel-gray eyes dropped to the spreading stain, then lifted, piercing her with a look that froze her in place. Richard Hale. The silence in the lobby thickened. Even the security guard stopped scrolling his phone. Clara's cheeks burned, but her voice steady. Deliberate broke the hush. "Well," she said softly, "at least it smells like fresh roast. Could be worse." A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers. No one joked with Richard Hale. His jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Clara met his gaze, refusing to shrink. "I spilled coffee on your suit. But I like to think of it as an early test, seeing how you handle imperfection." The receptionist stifled a gasp. Martha from accounting, walking by with a stack of folders, nearly dropped them. Richard's stare lingered on her face, as if measuring whether she was reckless or simply foolish. His voice, low and controlled, carried across the lobby. "Your name, Clara Bennett, your new secretary." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise. Perhaps annoyance that fate had delivered his new hire in such disastrous fashion. "My office. 10 minutes. Bring a towel." He strode past her, leaving the scent of expensive cologne mingled with burned coffee. The moment he disappeared, the whispers began. "You're finished," someone murmured. Not even an hour in, another whispered. Clara bent down, retrieved the empty paper cup, and straightened with a quiet dignity. Her pulse was hammering, but she forced her breathing steady. If this was the way her new job began, she would not allow it to end in humiliation. The elevator ride to the 30th floor felt endless. She stood alone, the mirrored walls throwing back her determined expression. She thought of the bills waiting at home, of her younger brother's college tuition she had promised to help with, of her mother's medicine cabinet filled with prescriptions she often rationed. Quitting wasn't an option. Surviving Richard Hale was her only choice. When she stepped out, the corridor was hushed, lined with frosted glass doors and brass plaques. Employees glanced up as she passed, some with pity, others with silent prayers. She reached the corner office, door ajar, and heard the faint rustle of paper. "Come in," his voice commanded before she could knock. Richard Hale stood by the window, the Chicago skyline stretching behind him. The coffee stain marred his immaculate suit, but he didn't move to change. He turned slowly, and Clara noticed how his face carried no trace of warmth, handsome in a way that was carved, not grown, like marble cut into the shape of a man. Clara held out a folded towel. "For the coffee?" she said evenly, "though I imagine a dry cleaner will do a better job." His lips pressed into a line. "Impression, Miss Bennett, is something you make with competence, not with clumsiness." "I agree," she answered. "So perhaps tomorrow I'll bring donuts instead of coffee." His brows lifted ever so slightly, as though he hadn't expected her to volley back. He placed a thick folder on the desk. "Your work for today. We'll see if your hands are steadier with paper than with coffee." Clara accepted the folder, its weight solid in her grip. She inclined her head. "Paper doesn't usually fight back, but if it does, I promise to win." For a fleeting second, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Then it was gone. "You may go. And Bennett," he added as she reached the door, "don't spill anything else on me." Her lips curved into a quiet smile. No promises. She left his office with her spine straight, folder pressed against her chest. Behind her, the whispers of employees followed like shadows. Some bet she wouldn't last a week. Others thought she wouldn't survive the day. But Clara Bennett knew herself. She wasn't here merely to type memos and fetch coffee. She was here for something more, though even she couldn't yet name it. The sound of Richard Hale's footsteps was enough to drain the color from most faces at Westwood Industries. Sharp, deliberate. The echo of his polished shoes down the hallway sent employees scattering into doorways, papers clutched tight to their chests. In this building, the rhythm of leather soles was not a sign of progress. It was the drumbeat of fear. Clara Bennett noticed it her first morning. Each time Richard left his office, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Shoulders hunched. People worked faster, but not better, as though the simple act of looking busy might shield them from his scrutiny. She had seen intimidation before, but never distilled so purely into habit. By mid-morning, Clara was already buried in the folder Richard had handed her. Pages of contracts, memos, and reports sprawled across her desk like an obstacle course designed to trip her up. She pushed back her sleeves and began sorting, steady fingers moving through the chaos. From the corner of her eye, she saw heads snap up. The sound came again, that unhurried, precise cadence of footsteps. Richard Hale was on the move. He appeared from the far end of the hallway. His suit changed, crisp and untouched by coffee. His face was unreadable marble. As he approached Clara's desk, the energy around them tightened like a bowstring. "Miss Bennett," he said, stopping directly in front of her. His voice carried the weight of authority, low and resonant. "Do you believe in second chances?" She looked up at him, calm, hands folded loosely on the desk. "For most things, yes. For spilled coffee on a $1,000 suit, that depends on the dry cleaner." A strangled laugh came from somewhere down the hall, quickly smothered. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Do you realize that everyone here has been too afraid to make a mistake for years? Fear keeps people sharp." Clara tilted her head. "Or it keeps them silent. Sharp isn't the same as effective. Mr. Hale, a sharpened blade left in its sheath can't cut anything." The air shifted. No one ever contradicted him. Not like this. Richard leaned down slightly, his shadow falling across her desk. "You presume much for someone on her first day, and you assume fear is loyalty." Clara replied softly, her voice steady. I've worked under bosses who led with compassion. People followed them not because they had to, but because they wanted to. For a heartbeat. His expression flickered surprise, then irritation at being surprised. He straightened, tugging at the cuff of his sleeve as if brushing away her words. "You think humor and charm will shield you here?" he asked. "No," Clara said simply. "But clarity might. If I'm going to work for you, Mr. Hale, you should know I won't crumble every time you raise your voice." That answer hung in the hallway like smoke. Employees who had frozen in place now avoided even glancing their way. Richard's gaze lingered on her longer than seemed necessary, as though he were deciding whether to crush her spirit immediately or wait to see if she cracked on her own. "Finally," he said, "be in my office at noon. I want to see if you can manage a briefing without tripping over your own papers." "Of course," Clara replied evenly. Then, after a pause, she added with the faintest smile, "Though, fair warning, I don't run on fear, I run on caffeine." For the first time, something that wasn't disdain touched Richard's eyes. Was it amusement? He turned abruptly, his shoes striking the floor like a closing argument. When he disappeared into his office, a collective exhale swept the hall. Martha from accounting leaned over, whispering, "You must have a death wish." Clara arranged the papers in neat stacks, her voice quiet but firm. "No, I just don't believe in worshiping someone who's only human." At noon, sharp, she entered Richard's office. The room was vast, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a floor-to-ceiling window that framed the skyline. He sat behind his desk, a monument of mahogany that looked heavy enough to withstand a storm. "Begin," he said, gesturing to the folder in her hands. Clara opened her notes, her voice steady as she outlined the contents vendor contracts overdue, memos awaiting his approval, quarterly numbers flagged for review. She spoke with clarity, not rushing, not shrinking. Richard watched her, expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a sharpness, cataloging every word. When she finished, she set the folder down and met his gaze. "Would you like me to prepare a summary for the board, or do you prefer to handle that yourself for a moment?" Silence filled the room. Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You didn't stumble," he said at last. "Not even once." Clara allowed a small smile. "I don't trip over paper, only rugs." His lips pressed together as though fighting a reaction, but then he waved her off. "That will be all?" She gathered her things, and as she reached the door, she heard him murmur, perhaps to himself, perhaps to her, "We'll see how long your confidence lasts." Clara closed the door gently behind her, her pulse steady. She knew what she had just done. She had set herself apart from every other employee at Westwood. Whether it would save her or destroy her was yet to be seen. By her second morning at Westwood Industries, Clara Bennett could feel the weight of a culture carved from silence. The office floors were spotless, the glass walls polished, the air filled with the faint scent of lemon cleaner and burnt coffee from the break room machine. Yet beneath the shine, something was missing. It wasn't productivity. The employees worked quickly, almost feverishly. It wasn't competence files were filed, numbers crunched, emails sent. What was missing was life. No laughter drifted across the cubicles. No idle chatter floated by the copy machines. Instead, Clara heard whispers that stopped the instant footsteps approached. The whispers, she soon realized, were often about her. "She won't last a week," muttered a man by the water cooler, not after talking back to him. Another replied, "Richard Hale chews through secretaries faster than paper clips." Clara kept her head high, pretending not to notice. But, inside, she absorbed every word, letting it shape her understanding of the world she had stepped into. At mid-morning, she carried a stack of reports to the accounting department. There she met Martha, a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes hidden behind thick glasses. Martha's hair was streaked with gray, pulled back in a bun that seemed to fight against gravity all day long. "Ah, you must be the new secretary," Martha said, adjusting her glasses. Her voice carried warmth, but also caution, as though kindness itself had become dangerous here. "I'm Martha, accounting, Clara, she replied, setting the reports down gently. It's nice to meet you. Martha leaned in, lowering her voice. Don't take it personally, dear. People are just worried for you. Richard doesn't take kindly to backtalk. I gathered, Clara said with a small smile. But I don't plan to spend my days walking on eggshells. Martha gave her a sad sort of smile, the kind worn by someone who had once felt the same but learned to swallow her voice. Bravery is admirable. Just be careful. Later that day, Clara ducked into the IT department, a space filled with humming machines and the faint glow of computer monitors. There she met Donna, a woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones and a laugh that seemed to bubble up even in the most inappropriate places. Clara Bennett, right? Donna asked, spinning her chair around. Word travels fast here. You're the one who baptized the boss in coffee. Clara blinked, then let out a laugh. That's one way to put it. Donna grinned. I like you already. Most new hires spend their first week trying not to breathe too loudly. You walk in with caffeine warfare. I'd call it clumsiness. But I'll take warfare if it sounds braver, Clara replied. Donna leaned back, smirking. Don't get too comfortable. The honeymoon phase in this place ends before lunch. By week's end, you'll either be promoted or escorted out. Optimistic, Clara said. Realistic, Donna corrected. Westwood doesn't run on coffee or electricity. It runs on fear. You'll see. Near the elevators. Clara nearly collided with Ethan, a lanky intern whose tie was always slightly askew. He stammered out an apology, his cheeks flushing red. It's fine, Clara said warmly. No harm done. Ethan nodded, eyes darting nervously. I'm Ethan, finance intern, Clara, secretary to Mr. Hale, she said, watching the flicker of alarm in his eyes at the mention of the name. You stood up to him yesterday, Ethan whispered, as though afraid Richard might hear from 3 floors away. People are still talking about it. And what are they saying, that you're brave or reckless? Maybe both. Ethan gave a weak smile. No one ever says no to him. Maybe that's the problem, Clara replied. Sometimes saying no is the only way things change. Ethan's smile faded. Careful. People who try to change things here don't usually last. By afternoon, Clara had begun to piece together the deeper story. She noticed employees bringing lunch from home not by choice, but because the cafeteria had cut back on subsidies. She overheard a conversation about dental plans that had been stripped down to bare minimums. In the break room, Martha confided quietly, My husband needs new glasses, but without the vision coverage, we're paying out of pocket. It's almost half my paycheck, Donna chimed in from the corner, shaking her head. They even cut the transportation vouchers. I drive 45 minutes each way, and now it's on me. Meanwhile, Mr. Hale probably spends more on a tie than I do on gas in a month. Clara sipped her lukewarm coffee from the machine, her eyes narrowing. These weren't isolated complaints. They were patterns cuts that bled the company's people dry while padding profits at the top. She thought of Richard Hale's immaculate suits, the way he carried himself like gravity answered to him. She thought of the silence in the halls, the way laughter had been replaced with whispers. This company, she realized, was starving its people not of money alone, but of dignity. That evening, as she gathered her things, Clara caught her reflection in the glass door, behind her. The office floor stretched out, tidy and efficient, but hollow. She remembered something her father used to say when she was a girl. A company isn't its building. Clara, it's its people. Forget that. And you've lost before you've begun. She tightened her grip on her tote bag. If Richard Hale ruled Westwood by fear, she would have to find another currency. Something stronger than silence. Something that could remind these people they mattered. The whispers in the halls might predict her downfall, but Clara wasn't afraid of whispers. She was afraid of a world where no one dared to speak at all. By Clara's 3rd day, it became obvious that Richard Hale was not the sort of man who forgave quickly. He hadn't yelled at her since the coffee incident, but silence could be sharper than any raised voice. Each time she passed his office, she felt his eyes follow her, assessing, calculating. At 9:00 sharp, the intercom on her desk buzzed. "Miss Bennett, my office." The words were crisp, clipped in order, not an invitation. Clara gathered her notepad, straightened her blouse, and walked down the long hallway. Employees peeked over cubicles as though watching someone march toward the gallows. Richard sat behind his desk, immaculately dressed in a charcoal gray suit. Without looking up, he slid a massive stack of files across the polished wood. "Organize these," he said, "alphabetically, chronologically, by relevance, and by department." Clara glanced at the files. There were thousands of pages. "By noon," he added, leaning back as though to savor her reaction. Clara didn't flinch. "Of course," she said evenly. She lifted the stack, though it nearly toppled from her arms, and left without another word. Back at her desk, Martha appeared with wide eyes. "You can't finish that in 3 hours. No one could." Donna, passing by with a mug of coffee, smirked. "It's not about finishing. It's about watching you drown." Clara smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I'll have to learn to swim." Instead of panicking, she spread the files out in neat rows. She pulled colored sticky notes from her drawer, then borrowed Ethan from finance for 30 minutes. Together, they created a simple system, color-coded tabs for each department, digital spreadsheets to track chronology, and a few handwritten charts for cross-referencing. By 11:55, the files weren't just sorted, they were immaculate. Clara carried the reorganized binders into Richard's office and set them on his desk. "All done," she said, "alphabetical, chronological, by relevance, and just for fun by color of cover. You never know when that might help." Richard's brows lifted almost imperceptibly. He flipped through the binders, silent. They were flawless. "You did this yourself?" he asked. "Mostly," Clara replied, "with a little creativity and help from technology. Fear doesn't move papers. Mr. Hale, systems do." For the briefest moment, something like admiration flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone. "Leave them here," he said curtly. "I'll review." The next morning, Richard called again. This time his request was stranger. "I need a silver pen," he said flatly. Clara frowned. "Any particular kind silver. Not chrome, not steel, silver." By this afternoon, he leaned forward, his gaze cool and deliberate. "Do not return until you have it." Clara nodded, understood. The moment she left his office, whispers started again. Donna caught up with her in the hall. "A silver pen. That's ridiculous. There isn't one in the entire building." "Then I'll have to improvise," Clara said. She spent the next hour making calls to office suppliers, stationery shops, even a jeweler 2 blocks away. Then she smiled. At 3:00, she returned to Richard's office carrying a box. She set it on his desk and, with a flourish, lifted the lid. Inside were dozens, no, hundreds of pens, all silver, some plastic, some aluminum, a few actual sterling pieces borrowed from the jeweler. "You wanted a silver pen," Clara said lightly. "I wasn't sure which shade you preferred, so I brought a selection. You may take your pick." For the first time, Richard froze. His gaze moved from the overflowing box to Clara's calm expression. Outside the glass wall, several employees had gathered discreetly. Martha pressed a hand to her mouth to hide a smile. Ethan's eyes shone with awe. Donna nearly choked on her coffee. Richard reached into the box, picked up a sleek sterling pen, and held it between his fingers. "This one will do." Clara nodded. "Excellent. I'll return the others." When she turned to leave, a murmur of laughter rippled through the hall. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That evening, the company buzzed like it hadn't in years. People stopped by Clara's desk with quiet words of encouragement. "You actually did it," Ethan whispered. "You made him speechless." Martha smiled softly. "It's been a long time since we've seen anyone stand their ground with him." Donna chuckled. "Careful, Clara, You keep this up, and you'll become a legend or a cautionary tale. Clara simply smiled. Maybe legends start as cautionary tales. Later, alone in his office, Richard turned the sterling pen in his hand. He should have been furious. He had set her up to fail, to stumble, to break under the weight of impossibility. Instead, she had turned the challenge back on him, not with defiance, but with ingenuity. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar tug at him. It wasn't anger, it wasn't triumph, it was curiosity. Who exactly was Clara Bennett, and why? Despite his better judgment, did he almost want her to stay? The building was nearly empty when Clara gathered her things that evening. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder without the chatter of employees. Most of the cubicles sat dark, computer screens asleep, leaving the air heavy with a quiet that felt less like peace and more like abandonment. Clara lingered, reviewing notes she hadn't had time to finish earlier. She preferred the stillness of late hours. No watchful eyes, no whispers, just space to breathe. As she passed Richard Hale's office on her way out, she noticed the door slightly ajar. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. Curiosity tugged at her. She hesitated, then paused when she saw him. Richard wasn't the polished figure she was used to. His tie was loosened. His jacket hung over the back of the chair. He sat hunched at his desk, elbows resting on the wood. A glass of untouched water beside him. In his hands, he held a small photograph. Clara stopped just outside, unseen. The picture was worn at the edges, its colors faded, even from a distance. Clara could tell it was a snapshot from decades ago. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, sat at the edge of a picnic table. A bright balloon floated behind him, yet no one else was in the frame. His expression was solemn, almost defiant, as though childhood joy had skipped over him entirely. Richard's thumb brushed the corner of the photo. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, now seemed tired. For the first time, Clara saw not the formidable CEO of Westwood Industries, but a man lonely, weighed down by memories he couldn't quite release. Something stirred in her chest. All week, she had studied him like one studies a storm, dangerous, unpredictable, best handled with caution. But now, the storm looked less invincible. Behind the thunder and lightning, there was a quiet ache, a human longing for something lost long ago. Clara shifted her weight, the floor creaking softly. Richard's head snapped up. The photograph disappeared into a drawer with practiced speed, the mask sliding back over his features in an instant. "Do you make a habit of spying on your employer?" "Miss Bennett." His tone was cold again, sharp as glass. Clara met his gaze steadily. "Not spying. Passing by. I was heading out. Then keep walking," he said, his voice flat. For a moment, Clara considered asking about the boy in the photo, about the look in his eyes, but something in Richard's expression warned her away. His walls were back up, higher than ever. "Good night, Mr. Hale," she said instead, her voice gentle. He gave no reply. Back in her car, Clara sat for a long moment before turning the key. She couldn't shake the image of him sitting there alone, holding on to a past no one else in the building had seen. The whispers in the halls painted Richard Hale as a tyrant, a man fueled by power and intimidation. But Clara now knew there was more, a shadow of loneliness that clung to him in the quiet hours. And though he had slammed the door on her glimpse of it, she had seen enough. Enough to realize that fear wasn't the only thing ruling Westwood Industries. Behind it all was a man who, perhaps, had forgotten how to be human. The next morning, Richard entered the office as he always did. Crisp suit, polished shoes, presence commanding silence. To anyone else, nothing had changed. But Clara noticed the faint tension around his eyes, the subtle stiffness in his shoulders. She thought of the boy in the photo and wondered what had become of him. Had he grown up lonely? Did he learn early that walls were safer than people? When Richard passed her desk, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His expression was unreadable, but Clara caught the flicker of recognition. He knew she had seen more than he intended, and he hated it. Still, Clara didn't look away. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest cracks were the ones that let light in. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the morning light. 12 leather chairs surrounded it, each filled with an investor whose signature could tilt the future of Westwood Industries. The air smelled faintly of cologne, paper, and power, an aroma Richard Hale wore like a second suit. Clara stood at the side of the room with a tray of coffee, invisible by design. Secretaries weren't supposed to speak in these meetings, only serve, smile, and vanish. Yet her eyes moved constantly, scanning the reports laid out in front of each guest. Richard began smoothly, his voice steady, commanding. As you can see, Westwood posted a 15% growth across all divisions last quarter. Efficiency has never been stronger. Charts lit up the projector screen, bars climbing, numbers gleaming with promise. Heads nodded around the table. But Clara's stomach tightened. She had reviewed the financial files late last night, a quiet habit she couldn't quite break. And what Richard presented didn't match what she had seen. The growth wasn't 15%. It was 12.3 to be exact. Still good, but not what was being claimed. Her pulse quickened. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she had missed something. But Clara trusted numbers. Numbers didn't lie. Richard continued, basking in the investor's approval. We've streamlined operations, cut unnecessary expenses, and maximized our workforce productivity. Unnecessary expenses. Clara thought of Martha's missing health benefits, Donna's fuel costs, Ethan's unpaid overtime. She set the tray down. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. "Excuse me," Clara said. Every head turned. Silence filled the room like an unexpected storm. Richard's eyes snapped to her, sharp and incredulous. Clara took a slow breath. "Mr. Hale, with respect, the numbers are incorrect. Actual growth was 12.3%. The 15% shown here is a result of miscalculated sums from the third quarter." A ripple moved through the room. One investor, a silver-haired man named Thomas Whitman, leaned forward. "Is that true?" Richard's jaw tightened. This is not the time. Clara stepped closer to the screen. She opened the folder she had tucked under her arm, filled with neat, handwritten notes and color-coded graphs. "Here," she said, sliding the papers across the table. "If you break down the quarterly figures, you'll see decimals were rounded upward. When added, they inflate the final result. 12.3% is accurate." Margaret Cole, a sharp-eyed investor, studied Clara's notes. "She's right. These calculations are precise." A murmur spread around the table. Richard stood perfectly still, but his face flushed. Thomas tapped his pen thoughtfully. "Accuracy builds trust. Hale, exaggeration, even unintentional, can damage it." Clara felt every eye on her, but her voice remained steady. "Transparency matters. A company should be proud of real numbers, not inflated ones." The silence that followed was electric. "Finally." Margaret smiled faintly. "I'd take honesty over a glossy report any day." Another investor chuckled. "Well said." "Refreshing, actually." Richard's throat tightened. He forced a polite smile, though his hand gripped the back of his chair hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Thank you, Miss Bennett, for your diligence." But the damage was done. The investors were looking at Clara now, not him. After the meeting, Clara slipped out quickly, her heart still racing. She hadn't planned to speak. It had simply been impossible to stay silent. Back in the hallway, Donna intercepted her. "What on earth did you just do?" she hissed, though her grin betrayed admiration. "Corrected an error," Clara said. "Corrected Richard Hale in front of half the financial district." Donna whispered. "That's not just reckless. That's legendary." Ethan approached, his face pale. "Clara, he's going to fire you." "Maybe," she admitted. "But I'd rather lose a job than lose the truth." Martha joined them, clutching a stack of invoices. Her eyes were wide but warm. "You gave them honesty. Nobody's done that in years. You should be proud." Clara smiled faintly. Numbers don't lie. Someone had to say it. In his office, Richard poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink. He stared at the folder Clara had left behind, filled with her meticulous notes. Each chart, each correction, was impeccable. She hadn't embarrassed him with arrogance, she had outperformed him with precision. He should have been furious. Instead, he felt something else, a sharp, reluctant respect. But respect was dangerous. Respect cracked the armor he had worn for decades. So Richard straightened his tie, shoved the folder aside, and told himself what he always did control must be restored, even if it meant breaking the one person bold enough to challenge him. Richard Hale closed his office door harder than he intended. The thud reverberated across the glass walls, sending a shiver down the quiet hallway. He stood still for a moment, breathing through his nose, the echo of Clara Bennett's voice still ringing in his ears. 12.3%. She had been right, painfully, humiliatingly right, and worse, she had been right in front of everyone who mattered: investors, stakeholders, the people whose opinions could tip the balance of his empire. Richard dropped into his chair, pressing his palms against the desk. Fury surged hot in his veins. No one corrected him. No one dared. That was the unspoken law of Westwood Industries. And yet, Clara had broken it without hesitation, her steady voice cutting through the polished silence of the boardroom. And damn it all, he couldn't shake the memory of the investors' faces, impressed, amused, even charmed, at her, not him. His pride recoiled, but something deeper whispered through the cracks: respect. Clara, meanwhile, sat at her desk with her hands folded neatly on her lap, staring at the blinking cursor on her computer screen. Her co-workers' words still buzzed around her: legendary, reckless, brave. She wasn't sure which label fit. She only knew that silence hadn't been an option. Her father had always told her, a leader who hides the truth from his people isn't leading, he's pretending. And what she had seen in Richard's report was pretense, whether deliberate or careless. But the question that tugged at her now wasn't about numbers. It was about him. Richard Hale was brilliant. His mind moved quickly, decisively. He carried himself with the certainty of a man born to command. So why, with all that talent, did he choose fear as his weapon? Why rule like a warden when he could inspire like a leader? Clara's thoughts lingered on the photograph she had glimpsed the night before the lonely boy at the picnic table. She wondered how much of Richard Hale, the CEO, was shaped by Richard Hale, the child who had learned too early that walls were safer than people. By late afternoon, Richard summoned her. His voice on the intercom was clipped. "Miss Bennett, inside, now." The tension in the room when she entered was palpable. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city skyline. "You embarrassed me," he said without turning around. "I told the truth," Clara replied quietly. He spun, his eyes flashing. "The truth has a time and place. A meeting with investors is not the time to undermine me." Clara held his gaze. "Would you rather they discovered the error themselves? Would you rather they wondered if you inflated numbers on purpose?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. She had struck the nerve he didn't want exposed. "Do you know what your job is, Miss Bennett?" he asked finally, his voice low, controlled. "Yes," she said. "To keep the office running, to prepare reports, to manage your schedule, but more than that, to make sure the right information reaches the right people, even when it's inconvenient." Her calmness unsettled him more than defiance would have. Most people quaked under his stare. She simply stood there, steady, unshaken. Richard turned back to the window, the city lights flickering against the glass. "You assume too much, and you hide too much," Clara said softly. The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. "Finally." Richard waved her away. "That will be all." Clara left without another word, but as the door clicked shut behind her, Richard remained frozen. staring at the skyline, yet seeing something else entirely her eyes, unflinching, reflecting back a truth he didn't want to face. That night, Richard poured himself a drink in his penthouse apartment. The city hummed below, its lights endless and indifferent. He should have felt victorious. Another meeting survived, another contract secured. Instead, he felt unsettled. Clara Bennett had stood against him, and yet he couldn't dismiss her. There was sharpness in her, yes, but also something steadier, something his empire of silence had long forgotten: conviction. And it gnawed at him, because conviction was dangerous. Conviction was contagious. Clara, at home in her modest apartment, lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought of the office, of the heavy silence that pressed down on the employees, of Martha's tired eyes, Donna's humor masking frustration, Ethan's nervous glances. She thought of Richard Hale, untouchable, unreadable, yet somehow cracked at the edges. It wasn't just a battle of wills anymore. Something deeper was unfolding. Not friendship, not trust, not yet, but a recognition. Like two flints struck together, sparks had flown, and sparks, Clara knew, had a way of growing into fire. By her second week, Clara Bennett had learned that the silence at Westwood Industries wasn't just born of fear, it was born of weariness, a kind of exhaustion that clung to people's shoulders like invisible weights. She saw it in the way Martha rubbed her temples over spreadsheets. She saw it in Ethan's long commute written on his tired face. She saw it in Donna's laughter that came too easily, the brittle kind used to mask frustration. It wasn't only Richard Hale who cast a shadow. It was the system itself. One afternoon, Clara stopped by the break room where Martha sat alone, unwrapping a sandwich from wax paper. Martha smiled when she saw her, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Long day?" Clara asked, pouring herself a cup of bitter coffee. "They're all long days now," Martha replied softly. Clara slid into the chair across from her. "You look pale. Everything all right?" Martha hesitated, then sighed, folding the sandwich back into its wrapper. "My tooth's been giving me trouble. Been needing a crown for months. But since they cut the dental plan, I keep putting it off." Clara's chest tightened. "That sounds painful." "It is," Martha admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "But my daughter's in grad school. She needs the money more than I need a dentist." "I'll manage." Clara reached across the table, laying a gentle hand on Martha's. "You shouldn't have to choose between your health and your family's future." Martha blinked hard, quickly dabbing at the corner of her eye. "That's just how things are here. We make do." But Clara couldn't accept that. Later that week, Clara caught Ethan fumbling with bus schedules at his desk. His tie was crooked, his hair sticking up in the back. Late night, she asked kindly. He gave a sheepish smile. "I miss my bus again. I've been taking 2 trains and a bus just to get here. Used to be easier when we had the transit stipend. But now," he shrugged, "half my pay goes to fares." Clara felt a flicker of anger. These weren't lazy workers. These were good people stretched thin by a company that squeezed every penny while Richard Hale signed contracts in $1,000 suits. She couldn't change policies overnight. She couldn't rewrite the benefit plan, but she could do something. The next morning, Clara walked into the office with a pink bakery box balanced on her arm. She set it on the break room counter and opened the lid to reveal warm cinnamon rolls, the kind that filled the air with sweetness. "For whoever needs a little sugar to survive the day," she said lightly, leaving a stack of napkins beside the box. At first, people glanced around nervously, as if suspecting a trap. But then Martha took one, and Donna followed, joking, "If this is poison, at least it smells delicious." Soon the room was buzzing with quiet laughter, the first real warmth Clara had heard since she arrived. The next day, she taped small notes to a few monitors. "You're doing better than you think. This office would be dull without you. One step at a time is still progress." By noon, Donna marched over with one of the notes in her hand. "Was this you?" Clara pretended to look confused. "Depends. Did it make you smile?" Donna grinned despite herself. "Maybe. Don't get caught." Hale would have a heart attack if he knew people were happy. But for Clara, these tiny rebellions weren't about defying Richard Hale directly. They were about giving people back a piece of themselves, a reminder that they weren't just cogs in a machine. That evening, as she packed up her desk, Clara noticed Richard standing in his office, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was clipped, his expression stone. But for a brief moment, he glanced out and saw the cinnamon roll box sitting empty in the break room, his brows furrowed. Clara wondered what he thought when he saw it. Did he recognize it as harmless generosity, or did he see it as a spark small, but dangerous that could spread if left unchecked? Either way, she knew one thing: she wasn't finished. The employees of Westwood had been starved of joy, of dignity, of basic care. She couldn't restore their benefits, but she could restore their spirit. And spirit, once awakened, was harder to silence than any memo or policy. At home that night, Clara wrote in her journal, a habit she had carried since college. It's not just about Richard Hale anymore. It's about everyone who works under him. They deserve more than scraps. They deserve to be seen. If fear is his currency, maybe kindness can be mine. She closed the notebook and set it aside, staring out her window at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere, Richard Hale sat in a penthouse, surrounded by wealth but utterly alone. She thought of Martha's tooth, Ethan's commute, Donna's brittle humor, and she thought of the boy in the photograph. Perhaps fear had always been easier for Richard Hale because he had never been shown another way. But Clara intended to change that, one cinnamon roll at a time. It started with a cinnamon roll, then a handful of sticky notes, then the faintest sound of laughter drifting through the halls. Richard Hale noticed. By the end of the week, something had shifted at Westwood Industries. Employees smiled more. Conversations lasted a few seconds longer. Even the air felt lighter, as though someone had cracked a window in a building long sealed shut. Richard stood in the hallway one morning, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Martha and Ethan chuckling over coffee. He had built this empire on discipline, efficiency, and silence. Now silence was breaking, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Miss Bennett, my office, now. The words boomed across the intercom, sharp as a gavel. Clara entered his office calmly, a notepad in hand, though she didn't need it. She could see the storm in his eyes. Richard didn't sit. He stood behind his desk, shoulders squared, voice low with controlled fury. "You've been busy." Clara met his stare. "I've been doing my job." "Your job," Richard snapped, "is not to play den mother. It is not to hand out pastries or scribble sentimental notes. Your job is to manage my office, nothing more." Clara took a breath. "And what about them?" She gestured toward the glass walls, the employees beyond. "Do they not deserve to feel human, or is survival the only incentive you believe in?" Richard's jaw tightened. Fear works. Fear keeps people in line. Her voice sharpened, but she kept it steady. "That's not leadership. That's dictatorship. You don't lead. Mr. Hale, you rule. You don't inspire loyalty, you demand obedience. And it's killing this company, one soul at a time." The words landed like blows. For a moment, the mask slipped, his fury raw. He slammed his hand on the desk, making the pens rattle. "You presume too much?" "No," Clara said. "Softer now. I see too much." Richard turned away, pacing toward the window. He stared out at the skyline, his reflection ghosting against the glass. For a moment, Clara thought he might throw her out. Instead, he stood in silence, and memories unwelcome, unbidden, rose like ghosts from the shadows. A boy, 10 years old, sat alone at a birthday party, a table stacked with gifts, a cake big enough for 20, but only 2 guests both nannies paid to attend. His parents were absent. Again, business first, always business. He remembered blowing out the candles with no one to cheer. He remembered the way silence felt heavier than any noise. Later, at boarding school, he had learned another truth: weakness invited cruelty. When boys mocked him for being alone, he built a wall of sharp words and sharper fists. Better feared than pitied, better cold than abandoned. Fear had carried him ever since. Richard's reflection blurred as his eyes stung, but he blinked hard, forcing the memory down. He turned back to Clara, his mask restored though thinner now. "You know nothing about me," he said harshly. Clara didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but I know what I see. And what I see is a man who confuses control with respect, who thinks silence is strength when it's really just fear." He stared at her, fury and something else warring in his expression. She was right, and he hated her for it. Hated her because he couldn't dismiss her words the way he dismissed others. "Leave," he said finally, his voice hoarse. Clara hesitated. She wanted to say more, to push further, but she knew the wall had slammed shut again. She nodded once and walked to the door. Just before leaving, she turned. "One day, Mr. Hale, you'll have to decide if fear is really the legacy you want to leave behind." The door closed with a soft click. Richard stood alone, his hand still pressed against the desk where he had slammed it. The office was silent again, but it no longer felt like victory. It felt like defeat, like someone had seen through the armor he had spent decades forging. He reached for the drawer where the photograph lay. His fingers hovered, then withdrew. He couldn't look at it. Not now. Instead, he sank into his chair, staring at the city beyond. Clara Bennett had declared war, not with weapons, but with truth. And the worst part was, some part of him wondered if she might win. The news arrived on a Monday morning, wrapped in a thick envelope stamped with the federal seal. Jennifer, Richard's longtime assistant before Clara, placed it on his desk with trembling hands. Richard broke the seal with a practiced calm, though a knot twisted in his stomach. He scanned the first page, and his face hardened. Notice of federal investigation. Suspicion of corporate tax fraud. The words struck like iron. Within an hour, whispers spread through Westwood Industries like wildfire. A federal investigation meant scandal, headlines, and possibly the collapse of everything Richard had built. Employees avoided eye contact in the halls. Investors began calling every 5 minutes. Even the janitor looked uneasy as he emptied trash bins outside the boardroom. Richard convened an emergency meeting. The mahogany table gleamed under the sterile lights, but no one dared admire it. Tension hung thicker than the city smog outside. Robert Langston, the company's chief financial officer, sat at the far end of the table, impeccably dressed in a navy suit. His silver hair and calm smile gave him the air of someone unshaken by storms. He had been with Richard for 15 years, the keeper of the books, the man Richard trusted with numbers too heavy for anyone else. "It's a misunderstanding," Robert said smoothly, tapping a manicured finger on the table. "Auditors chase shadows all the time. We'll cooperate, provide documents, and within days, it'll be resolved." Richard studied him. Robert's voice carried confidence, but something in his eyes too steady, too rehearsed, set Richard's instincts on edge. Clara sat quietly near the corner, allowed into the meeting because Richard hadn't yet told her to leave. She flipped through the packet of allegations with the sharp eye of someone who had grown accustomed to double-checking numbers. Her brow furrowed. "These aren't shadows," she said finally, her voice breaking the tension like glass. "There are clear inconsistencies, wire transfers to shell accounts that don't exist on our vendor list, and they all bear Robert's signature." The room went still. Robert chuckled, low and dismissive. "Miss Bennett, with respect, you're a secretary. These documents are far beyond your comprehension." Clara didn't blink. "I may be a secretary, Mr. Langston, but numbers don't lie, and these numbers don't add up." Martha shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ethan ducked his head, and Donna raised her eyebrows, impressed at Clara's audacity. Richard's voice cut through the murmurs. "Enough." He closed the folder, his jaw tight. Inside, war raged. Pride told him to silence Clara, to defend Robert, the man who had stood beside him through mergers, acquisitions, and endless nights of calculations. But another voice, quieter and far more dangerous, whispered that Clara was right. For the first time, Richard questioned the one man he had trusted without hesitation. That evening, Richard found Clara still at her desk, poring over spreadsheets she had quietly borrowed from the finance department. The floor was nearly empty, the only sounds the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of her pen. "You shouldn't be here," he said. She looked up. "Neither should you." He stepped closer, studying the numbers she had spread across her desk. Columns of figures, color-coded notes, arrows connecting suspicious entries. She had spent hours untangling threads most accountants would overlook. "You think it's Langston?" Richard said, not as a question, but as a grim acknowledgement. Clara's eyes met his. "I think someone with that much access is either careless or complicit, and Robert Langston doesn't strike me as careless." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. "If what you're suggesting is true, then I've been blind for years." Clara's tone softened. "You weren't blind. You were alone. You trusted the wrong man because you had no one else to trust." Her words cut deeper than he expected. He hated the truth in them, yet he couldn't deny it. Finally, Richard sank into the chair opposite her. For the first time, he didn't look like the untouchable CEO. He looked like a man cornered by his own empire. "I need your help," he said quietly. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "My help? You see things others don't. You question. You dig. You refuse to accept what's handed to you. I need that now." He hesitated, pride still fighting the words. "I need you to help me find the truth." Clara studied him, weighing the sincerity in his eyes. She had never heard him sound so human, so vulnerable. "All right," she said finally, "but on one condition." His brow furrowed. "What condition you have to stop treating me like your enemy? If we're doing this, we're partners. Not boss and secretary. Partners." The word tasted foreign to Richard, like something he hadn't spoken in decades. Partners. But, he nodded. "Partners," he said. Later that night, Clara walked out of the building into the cool air of downtown. The city lights glittered, indifferent to the storms brewing inside Westwood Industries. She tightened her coat around her shoulders, her mind buzzing with numbers and suspicions. Richard Hale had finally let her in, not as an assistant, but as an ally. And deep inside, she felt the shift. The war between them had ended. A greater war had just begun. The investigation had consumed every corner of Westwood Industries. Piles of financial records were stacked high in Richard's office, the once pristine space now resembling a war room. Clara spent hours combing through files, cross-checking numbers, and connecting dots that others had overlooked. It was late one night when she found it, a dusty folder tucked deep inside the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet. She hadn't been searching for it, only looking for vendor invoices, but the folder's faded label caught her attention. Personal, R.H. Clara hesitated. Curiosity wrestled with respect for privacy. But the Richard she had come to know, the man who wrapped himself in walls of steel, would never volunteer what was inside. And something told her that to understand the present, she needed to see the past. She opened the folder. The first photograph startled her. A boy, maybe 10 years old, sat at the head of a long banquet table. Silver candlesticks gleamed. Platters of food covered the table, and a towering cake with 10 candles stood untouched. But there were no other children. No laughter, no one singing happy birthday. Just the boy, staring at the cake with hollow eyes. Clara turned the photo over, scrawled in faded ink, 10th birthday. March 14th. She set it down gently and pulled out another, Richard as a teenager, standing on stage with a trophy in hand. Rows of empty chairs stretched behind him. No cheering crowd, no proud parents. Then came newspaper clippings. Young heir to Hale fortune wins, academic award. Son of prominent business moguls continues legacy of excellence. Each article praised achievement. None mentioned love. At the bottom of the folder lay a letter, creased and yellowed. Clara's breath caught as she read it. Dear Richard, We regret we cannot attend your award ceremony. Business in Zurich demands our attention. Congratulations nonetheless. Love, mother and father, love, the word written, but never lived. Put that away. Richard's voice came from the doorway, low and sharp. Clara jumped, the letter slipping from her hand. He stepped into the office, his face pale, his eyes storm dark. For a moment, he didn't look like the untouchable CEO. He looked like the boy in the photograph cornered, exposed. Clara began, but Richard cut her off. You had no right. His jaw tightened. Those files are none of your concern. Clara swallowed, her chest heavy. I wasn't snooping. I was searching the invoices. It was buried there. I didn't mean to. She trailed off, then steadied her voice. But Richard, what I saw, it explains so much. His fists clenched at his sides. Explanations don't matter. Excuses don't matter. I'm not talking about excuses, Clara said softly. She held up the photo of the birthday party. I'm talking about this boy, alone at a table built for 20. This is the child who became the man standing in front of me. Richard's eyes flicked to the photo, then away, as though the sight burned. Stop! His voice cracked. You don't know what you're talking about. Clara stepped closer, her tone firm but gentle. I know what loneliness looks like. I know what it does. You grew up with wealth, power, expectations but not love. So you built armor. You decided if you couldn't be loved, you'd be feared. His shoulders stiffened. Shame and anger warred inside him. Enough? No, Clara said, her voice rising. Someone has to say it. You are not responsible for their neglect. That wasn't your fault. But you are responsible for what you've done with it. You're responsible for this company, for these people. Richard turned away, staring out the window at the glittering city. His reflection looked older than he remembered, wearier. And what if fear is all I know? Then learn something new, Clara whispered. Silence filled the office, thick and heavy. Clara placed the photo back into the folder and closed it carefully, as though returning a secret to the shadows. She crossed her arms, watching him struggle. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his pride cracking under the weight of memory. For the first time, Clara realized how much of Richard's cruelty was not malice, but survival. You don't have to keep living as that boy, she said. You can choose to be someone different, for yourself, for them. He turned then, his eyes meeting hers. The mask was gone. All that remained was a man who looked utterly human. I don't know if I can, he admitted. The words sounded foreign on his tongue, as though vulnerability was a language he had never spoken. Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. Then start small. Change one thing. One choice at a time. You're not to blame for your childhood, Richard, but you are accountable for the legacy you leave now. Richard sank into his chair, running a hand over his face. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, Why do you care? Clara considered. Because I believe people can change, and because the people in this building deserve a leader, not a tyrant. And maybe, she hesitated, maybe you deserve a second chance too. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to scoff, to deflect with sarcasm, but the words stuck. Instead, he only nodded, once, as if acknowledging a truth too fragile to speak aloud. The war outside in the boardroom, in the numbers, was still raging. But tonight, another battle had begun inside Richard Hale, and Clara knew if he could win that one, everything else might follow. Stacks of papers covered every inch of the long oak conference table. Spreadsheets, bank statements, wire transfers, years of financial history compressed into columns of numbers that might save or doom Westwood Industries. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, the only sound in the building at midnight. Clara rubbed her eyes, pushing aside an empty coffee cup. Across the table, Richard leaned forward, sleeves rolled up, his tie long discarded. He looked less like the CEO who ruled with fear and more like a man stripped to his rawest self. Tired, driven, cornered. Here, Clara said, tapping one of the ledgers. See this pattern. Transfers of exactly $20,000 every single month, routed through shell vendors. Look at the dates. They start the week after the Chen acquisition. Richard slid the papers toward him, scanning quickly. His jaw clenched. Langston signed every one of them. Not surprising, Clara said, but notice the timing always late Friday afternoons. When oversight was thin, he knew how to bury them. Richard swore under his breath, something rough and uncharacteristic. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. If the auditors find this before we do, we're finished. My name, this company, it'll all burn. Clara crossed her arms. How long do we have? He looked up, eyes dark. 72 hours, maybe less. The words hung heavy in the room. 72 hours to clear his name, to save the jobs of hundreds, to untangle the knots someone had deliberately tied. They worked in silence for a while, the kind that pressed on the lungs. Richard highlighted suspicious entries while Clara cross-referenced them with vendor addresses. Together, they built a trail of red flags that pointed again and again to Robert Langston. But as the hours passed, Clara couldn't ignore the weight in her chest. The more she worked alongside Richard, the harder it became to separate the tyrant who had once humiliated employees from the man now sitting across from her, stripped of his armor. She caught herself studying him, his furrowed brow, the faint tremor in his hand when exhaustion pressed too hard, the way he chewed absently on his pen like a nervous schoolboy. And she hated herself for wondering if there was more humanity beneath the steel exterior than she wanted to admit. At 2 a.m, Richard broke the silence. His voice was rough, but not sharp. Clara, she looked up. He hesitated, the words foreign on his tongue. Finally, he said, I need you. The confession was small, almost fragile, yet it struck her harder than his fiercest outburst. Her instinct was to deflect with humor, to say, you only realize that now. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't speaking as a CEO issuing commands. He was speaking as a man stripped bare by fear and truth. Clara swallowed, her throat tight. You've never needed anyone before. That's the problem, he said quietly. She leaned back, arms crossed, torn between empathy and caution. Richard, you've spent years crushing people under your heel. You cut their benefits, ignored their voices, made this place a machine instead of a community. And now you're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to trust the man sitting here with you tonight, he said. Not the one you met that first morning. Not the tyrant you think you know. Just me. Clara searched his face for deception, pride, arrogance, those she knew well. But what she saw now unsettled her more than rage ever could vulnerability. Her thoughts tangled. Could she put faith in a man who had ruled through fear? Could she risk being betrayed the way he had betrayed so many others? Her heart whispered yes. Her mind screamed no. She stood and walked to the window, staring at the city lights flickering below. The glass reflected both of them, her silhouette tense, his seated form slumped with fatigue. You're asking me to gamble my integrity on you, she said finally. Why should I? Richard's voice was low. Because if you don't, this company dies, and the people you've been fighting for, Martha, Ethan, Donna, they'll lose everything. If not for me, do it for them. The argument hit its mark. Clara thought of Martha, clutching her dental bills. Ethan, too shy to ask for help. Donna, laughing her way through despair. They didn't deserve to suffer for Robert Langston's treachery. She turned back, meeting Richard's eyes. Fine, I'll help you, but this isn't blind loyalty. I'm here for them, not you. A flicker of something crossed his face. Hurt, maybe, but he nodded. Fair enough. The clock ticked past. 3 a.m. Papers rustled, pens scratched, coffee cups multiplied. For the first time, Richard and Clara worked as true partners, not adversaries. Not boss and subordinate, but two people carrying the same impossible weight. As dawn crept across the skyline, Clara caught Richard staring at her, not with disdain, but with something else she couldn't quite name. She looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the numbers. But deep down, she felt it too. The dangerous possibility that trust, once impossible, might be growing in the cracks of crisis. The boardroom still smelled of stale coffee and midnight panic when Andrew Sinclair first appeared at Westwood Industries. He arrived without fanfare, a tall man in his early 40s, dressed in a tailored gray suit that seemed designed not to flaunt wealth, but to whisper it. His smile was easy, practiced but warm, the kind of smile that disarmed rather than intimidated. Richard recognized him immediately, a venture capitalist with deep ties in New York, known for rescuing companies on the brink or dismantling them if the numbers didn't please him. Andrew shook Richard's hand firmly. "Always a pleasure to meet the man behind the legend," he said. His eyes flicked briefly to Clara, who was gathering papers at the end of the table. "And who might this be?" "Clara Bennett," Richard said curtly, his tone sharper than necessary. Clara extended her hand with a polite smile. "I work with Mr. Hale." Andrew's handshake was steady, his gaze direct. "Work with, not for." Good distinction. Richard bristled. The meeting itself was uneventful discussion of contracts, investments, possible partnerships. But when it ended, Andrew lingered. "Miss Bennett, do you have a moment?" Richard opened his mouth to dismiss the request, but Clara spoke first. "Of course." They stepped into the hallway. Andrew lowered his voice. "I'll be direct. I've heard about what you've done here, challenging projections, catching errors, holding your ground in rooms most people would flee from. That kind of courage is rare." Clara blinked, caught off guard. Praise was something she received from co-workers, not from men like Andrew Sinclair. He continued, "I'm expanding my own firm, Collins and Whitman. We need a director of operations. Starting salary would be $300,000 a year, plus performance bonuses, full benefits, creative freedom." Her breath caught. $300,000, nearly 10 times her current pay. The promise of stability, respect, and independence wrapped neatly in a single offer. Andrew studied her carefully. "I can see you're weighing it already. Don't decide now. Think about it. Just know your talent is wasted here." Clara managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman?" "Andrew," he corrected gently. "And if you'd like, dinner, sometimes strictly professional." "Of course." His smile softened. "For now." That night, Clara sat in her apartment staring at the business card Andrew had pressed into her hand. The numbers stared back at her like a beacon. Security, freedom, a future without constant battles against Richard Hale's temper. Yet her thoughts drifted back to the long hours at Westwood, the laughter in the break room after she brought pastries, the quiet gratitude in Martha's eyes, Ethan's shy smile when she encouraged him, and Richard, shoulders bowed under the weight of secrets, whispering, "I need you." Her chest tightened. Safety with Andrew, risk with Richard. Which future belonged to her? The next morning, she found Richard already in the office. He looked up as she entered, his eyes flicking to the card in her hand before she could tuck it away. "Whitman gave you an offer. It wasn't a question." Clara straightened. "He did. Director of Operations. A salary I can't ignore." Richard's mouth tightened. "And are you planning to accept?" She hesitated. "I haven't decided." Something flashed in his eyes, sharp, dangerous. Not the controlled fury she'd seen before, but something raw. Jealousy. "Whitman doesn't know you," Richard snapped. "He sees numbers on a page, hears gossip about a bold secretary. He doesn't see the real you, and you do." Clara challenged, her voice calm but cutting. His jaw worked, but no words came. She softened, just slightly. "Maybe Andrew sees potential. Maybe he sees someone worth investing in, not someone to order around." The words landed harder than she intended. Richard leaned back, crossing his arms as though bracing against a blow. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. "Finally," Richard said, low and strained, "I can't lose you." Clara froze. His eyes locked on hers. Not just because of the investigation. Not just because you're useful. I can't lose you. Clara! The air between them tightened, charged. Clara's pulse raced, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. You've spent years making people feel replaceable, she said softly. Why should I believe I'm any different? Richard's voice cracked just slightly. Because you are. Clara looked away, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust the flicker of humanity she'd glimpsed in late-night hours. But another part whispered caution. Richard Hale was still the man who had built an empire on fear. Could one broken confession erase years of cruelty? The business card in her pocket pressed against her leg, heavy as a stone. She turned back to him, her voice steady, though her heart wavered. I'll stay for now, but not for you, Richard. For the people who need this company to survive. Richard nodded, but the flicker of jealousy in his eyes remained. And Clara knew whether he admitted it or not. Something deeper had begun to unravel inside him. The clock was ticking. Less than 48 hours remained before the federal investigators would issue their findings. If Richard and Clara didn't expose Robert Langston's schemes in time, Westwood Industries would collapse under the weight of suspicion. The two of them worked late into the night, drafting a plan that balanced on the knife's edge of risk. We can't simply accuse him, Richard said, pacing the office. Robert knows the system too well. He'll bury us under legal jargon before we take a breath. Clara spread papers across the desk, her eyes sharp. Then we make him reveal himself. A trap. Something he can't resist. Richard stopped, studying her. You sound disturbingly comfortable with high-stakes deception. Clara gave a faint smile. Fear sharpens people. Remember? Maybe your methods rubbed off on me? He almost laughed, but the weight of what they faced pressed it back down. The next afternoon, they set the stage. Clara accidentally left a draft report on the copier, one that hinted at a phantom audit scheduled for Friday, supposedly designed to review every transfer Robert had authorized. It didn't take long. Robert strolled by the copier, spotted the file, and tucked it into his briefcase with a glance over his shoulder. Exactly as planned, from a distance, Richard and Clara exchanged a look. The bait was taken. That evening, Robert sat across from Richard in the boardroom, his polished smile firmly in place. I hear auditors are coming sooner than expected, Robert said casually. You must be under a lot of pressure. Richard leaned back, feigning irritation. Pressure doesn't scare me. What does concern me is that certain irregularities might surface. Transfers, shell accounts. Robert's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flicked just for a second to Clara, who sat quietly at the end of the table. And what if, Robert said slowly. Those irregularities pointed somewhere other than finance. Clara leaned forward. Then, whoever's responsible would still be guilty. Robert chuckled, low and cold. You're bold for a secretary. Partners, Richard corrected sharply. Robert's mask slipped for the briefest moment. His voice hardened. Be careful. Richard, partnerships can be dangerous, especially when someone's feeding the FBI the wrong story. The air in the room tightened, and then, right on cue, the door opened. Two men in dark suits entered, badges flashing. Mr. Langston, one asked. We'd like a word. Robert froze. It had been Clara's idea to loop the FBI in ahead of time, to give them enough evidence to act, but not enough to alert Robert. The false audit was bait not for Richard, but for the agents listening just outside. Robert's composure cracked. This is absurd. You can't, Mr. Langston, the agent interrupted. We have records of wire transfers routed through accounts tied to you personally, offshore holdings, Cayman Islands. Care to explain? For the first time in years, Robert Langston stammered. Clara sat perfectly still, her heart pounding. The trap had sprung, but Robert wasn't finished. He leaned across the table, his voice low, venomous. Do you really think this will save you, Richard? You've built your empire on fear and lies. You'll fall, with or without me. And when you do, his gaze flicked to Clara. She'll go down too. Richard surged to his feet, fury blazing. "Leave her out of this!" But Robert only smirked as the agents escorted him out, his words hanging in the air like smoke. The building was eerily quiet once the FBI left with Robert in custody. Richard stood at the head of the table, his chest rising and falling as though he'd just fought a war. Clara gathered the scattered documents with trembling hands. "You were brilliant," Richard said finally, his voice raw. Clara looked up. "We were brilliant. You trusted me, remember." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, softer. "No, Clara. I didn't just trust you. I needed you. And not only for this." Her breath caught. Richard stepped closer, the hardness in his eyes replaced with something more fragile, more dangerous. "If this company burns tomorrow, if the board abandons me, if the headlines destroy my name, none of it matters if I lose you." The words tumbled out before pride could stop them. Clara's heart thudded. For weeks she had seen glimpses of the man behind the armor, the boy who had grown up alone. Now, for the first time, he admitted it openly. She was more than an ally, more than a partner. She was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. But before she could reply, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You think Langston was the only one? Watch your back." Clara's hand trembled as she held the phone. The war wasn't over. The morning Robert Langston was led out of Westwood Industries in handcuffs, the building held its breath. Employees gathered in clusters, whispering as they watched the man who had once strutted the halls now bow his head to avoid the cameras flashing outside. For weeks, fear had ruled the company. But that day, something shifted. Richard Hale stood at the glass wall of the boardroom, watching the chaos below. His reflection stared back at him, pale and weary. For the first time in years, he didn't see the tyrant he had built himself to be. He saw a man who had nearly lost everything, not just his company, but the one person who had dared to see him as human. 2 days later, Richard called a meeting with the entire staff, the atrium filled with nervous employees, their murmurs echoing off the marble floors. Clara stood off to the side, her heart steady but hopeful. Richard stepped onto the platform, not in his usual $1,000 suit, but in a simple gray jacket. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. For too long, he began. "This company has been run by fear. I told myself fear made people sharp. I told myself silence made us efficient. But I was wrong." The room stilled. Dozens of eyes widened. No one had ever heard Richard Hale admit he was wrong. He continued, "I forgot the truth that a company isn't its profits, its buildings, or even its reputation. A company is its people, and I have failed you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Martha pressed a hand to her mouth. Ethan blinked hard. Donna smirked faintly, but her eyes glistened. Richard's voice steadied, starting immediately. "Benefits will be restored. Health care, transportation stipends, fair overtime. I can't undo the damage overnight, but I will begin. Not because the law demands it, not because investors demand it, but because you deserve it." For the first time, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt sacred. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Martha first, then Donna, then the entire atrium until the sound rose like a storm. Clara watched Richard's face as he stood there, not basking in the applause, but humbled by it. And she thought this is the man he could have been all along. That evening, Clara sat in her apartment with Andrew Sinclair's business card in her hand. She thought of his promised stability, wealth, a career without battles. She set the card down. Her heart had already chosen. The next morning, she sought Andrew out in the lobby, where he was speaking with investors. He greeted her with his usual polished smile. "Have you decided, Clara?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying at Westwood." Andrew's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Even after everything you've seen, after everything Richard has been," Clara nodded, "because people here need someone who won't walk away. And because Richard is changing. I want to be part of that change." Andrew studied her, then inclined his head, his charm restored. Then I wish you luck. If he falters, my door is always open. Clara smiled politely, but as she turned away, she knew she would never use that door. Later that night, Richard found her still working in the office, reviewing new benefit drafts. He stood in the doorway for a moment, silent. Then he stepped inside. "You turned Whitman down," he said. Clara looked up. "I did." Why? She set her pen down, meeting his gaze. "Because money isn't everything. Because I believe in this company. And because—" She hesitated, then smiled softly. "Because I believe in you." Richard's throat tightened. He crossed the room slowly, as though afraid the moment might vanish if he rushed. "I don't deserve that," he said. "Maybe not," Clara admitted. "But you're trying, and that matters." He stopped just a step away, his voice lower now, almost fragile. "Clara, I've spent my life building walls. I thought they kept me strong, but they only kept me alone. You tore them down. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, I realized I don't just need you for this company. I need you, period." Clara's chest ached with emotion. She had waited weeks for honesty, and now it was here. Unguarded, unpolished, real. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Richard Hale, are you actually admitting you have feelings?" He almost laughed, shaking his head. "I suppose I am, and for once, I'm not ashamed of it." For the first time since she met him, he didn't look like the man everyone feared. He looked like a man finally free of his own prison. Clara reached for his hand. He took it, hesitantly at first, then with quiet certainty. The atrium below hummed with life as employees stayed late, chatting, even laughing. The company was not healed overnight, but it was healing. And in the glass-walled office above, Clara and Richard stood together, partners not just in crisis, but in hope. 6 months had passed since Robert Langston's arrest, but for the employees of Westwood Industries, it felt like an entirely different lifetime. The office that had once been silent, suffocated by fear, now pulsed with a quiet energy. Laughter spilled from the break room, where a new espresso machine stood beside baskets of fresh fruit. The IT department had a corkboard covered with memes and jokes, courtesy of Donna, Ethan, the once shy intern, now confidently shared ideas during meetings. Martha, finally able to afford her dental care, wore a smile that seemed brighter than the polished floors of the atrium. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic, it was cultural. Richard Hale had changed too. The employees noticed it first in the little things. He started walking the halls without the heavy thud of intimidation in his step. He stopped barking orders through assistants and began asking questions directly, genuinely listening to the answers. And most surprisingly of all, he smiled. It wasn't the sharp, calculated smile of a CEO playing a part. It was real. Clara sat in her new office on the 12th floor, sunlight pouring across her desk. Her nameplate read, Clara Bennett, Director of Special Projects below the title. In smaller, cheeky script, she had insisted on spilled coffee specialist. She had laughed when Richard resisted the idea, but he eventually relented, admitting, "If it reminds you not to throw lattes at me again, fine." The truth was, Clara loved the reminder. That single clumsy moment had set everything in motion. That morning, she was reviewing proposals for the employee wellness program, a plan that now included flexible schedules, childcare stipends, and mentorship opportunities. A knock came at the door. She looked up to see Richard standing there, not with a stack of files or a frown, but with 2 steaming cups in his hands. "Delivery," he said, stepping inside. Clara raised an eyebrow. "You bringing coffee? What's the catch?" "No catch." He set 1 cup in front of her, then held up the other. "Just thought I'd take the risk for once. And don't worry this time, I won't spill it." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "Look at you, conquering your fears." He smirked. "No, just learning from the best teacher I've ever had." Their eyes met across the desk. No walls, no fear, only trust. That afternoon, Richard gathered the staff in the atrium once again. He no longer stood on a platform above them. Instead, he walked into the center of the crowd, shoulder to shoulder with his employees. "I used to think leadership was about being untouchable," he began, "about control, about fear. But you showed me, especially one of you, that a true leader is not feared, but trusted." Clara felt her chest tighten as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Richard didn't call her name, but he didn't have to. "From here on," Richard continued, "Westwood will stand for more than profit. We will stand for people. We will grow. Yes, but never at the cost of those who make this company what it is. Together, we'll write a different story." The applause that followed wasn't hesitant this time. It was thunderous. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Richard and Clara lingered by the window, watching the city below. "You did it," Clara said softly. Richard shook his head. "We did it. For the first time in years, the weight of his father's cold expectations, his mother's absence, and his own mistakes felt lighter." He glanced at Clara. "You stayed, even when you could have left. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I'll never forget that." Clara smiled. "Good, because you're still a work in progress." He chuckled. "I know, but at least I have a partner now." She reached for her cup of coffee, lifting it in a mock toast. "To partners?" Richard clinked his cup against hers. "To partners." As the evening sun bathed the office in golden light, Westwood Industries buzzed with life, no longer ruled by fear but carried by trust. And for Richard and Clara, what had begun with spilled coffee had grown into something lasting, proof that even the hardest hearts could change, and even the coldest companies could find warmth again. Because in the end, true leadership wasn't about power, it was about people, at its heart. This story isn't just about a company or a CEO, it's about people, and the choices we make and how we treat one another. Richard Hale built his empire on fear, believing power came from control. But it took Clara Bennett, an ordinary woman with extraordinary courage, to show him that true strength is found in compassion, not intimidation. The lesson is simple, yet timeless. Leadership is not about ruling, it's about listening, caring, and creating trust. Fear may force people to obey, but it never wins their hearts. Trust, on the other hand, has the power to transform not just workplaces, but lives. For many of us, this truth applies beyond business. In our families, our friendships, our communities, the way we treat others will echo back to us. Are we remembered for how much we achieved, or for how deeply we cared? Clara's courage reminds us that one voice, spoken with honesty, can change the course of many lives. And Richard's transformation shows us it is never too late to grow, to soften, and to choose a different path. Because in the end, respect may be earned, but trust must be nurtured. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and joining this journey. If Clara and Richard's story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need the reminder, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life, and we can't wait to share the next one with you.